It's 1889. A man clumsies his way down a dark corridor, juggling a tripod and a heavy camera, trying to step past rotting garbage and nod on the children who might be sleeping or playing in the darkness. Entering a room in the most densely populated neighborhood in the world, piled high with luggage, knickknacks, but most of all people. A dozen or more crammed in the room without as much as a window or a faucet. Using new flash technology, he captures the lives of people living in the world's worst slums, a world unseen to millions of Americans. And just what did his photos reveal about American cities and the lives of American immigrants living in them? Well, I'm glad you asked. I'm Dan Luer, and this is History for Humans. This photograph was taken by the photographer just introduced, Jacob Riis, titled 5 Cent Spot. Spend a second and look across the room. What jumps out at you? What story is it telling you? Surely a picture is worth 1,000 words or more, but I guess a room like this is only 5 cents a night. But how many men do you count? I count 7 if those are feet under the covers right there in the front. But in some rooms like this, there are sometimes as many as 20, and women and children as well. Riis here in this photograph, and thousands of others like it, was trying to bring the lives of these immigrants in New York City to public attention through the power of photography, long before the hashtag. And if your jaw dropped at all at seeing it, then you just got Riised.
Wait, what's Riis, Mr. Luer? Is that a term from our notes?
It's a term I just made up to pay homage to my man here, Jacob Riis. Anything? Anyway, onward to history. Anyway, our exploration question for today is, what did Jacob Riis's photos reveal about American cities and the lives of immigrants? And did it capture the whole story? So America had generally been a nation of farmers since the colonial days. With a seemingly limitless amount of open land, only sparsely populated by Native Americans, whom Americans didn't seem to mind stealing from anyways, urbanization, or the growth of cities, was relatively slow in America. Why crowd into a slum or an apartment and work for a boss when you could own land on the cheap and live in the open air? Even most manufacturing or industrial production before the Civil War was mostly done in the countryside in mills powered by waterways in New England. But then urbanization took off after the Civil War. In 1860, America had only 16 cities with 50,000 people. But by 1890, there were over 11 cities with 250,000 and several approaching 1 million. New York became the world's busiest harbor and the second largest city after London, and by the 1920s passed her. With industrialization and new marvels of innovation, cities offered spectacles found nowhere else. Electrified streets and housing, mostly for the wealthy at the time. Amusement parks like Coney Island with roller coasters and games, and there was motion pictures and professional sports and shopping. And the first department stores that brought in middle class and wealthy Americans like Macy in New York City and Marshall Field's in Chicago to engage what was slowly becoming America's favorite pastime, shopping.
So most Americans didn't have that kind of stuff if they didn't live in the city. No malls, no electricity, no sports. What the heck did kids do for fun back then?
It was a rough life, Kalohe, but back then there was this thing called play that kids tended to do. It seems strange today, but they would actually gather.
Oh, okay, I got it. But still, rough life.
Yeah, and luring more people than almost anything else were job opportunities. Just as they do today, many rural Americans fled the countryside to cities looking for jobs, and then coming by the millions to seek opportunity in America's cities were immigrants from all over the world. And that is what brought a young Jacob Riis to America's shores in 1870. Riis was born the third out of 15 children in Denmark. He had to work from a young age to help support his family, but even at the age of 11, he decided to donate all the money that he had to a poor family in squalid housing, a foreshadowing of his life's great work. But then at the age of 21 years old, with only $40 in his pocket, he boarded ship for America in hopes to make his way as a carpenter. Landing in New York Harbor, the bustling city, the crowded spaces, the traffic-ridden streets, led him to spend half his money the very first day on a handgun for protection. And he worked here and there, finding odd jobs, and amidst the spectacle of city life, he found only squalor. He scoured for food, eating other people's leftovers and what they had thrown away, and eventually eating rotting fruit to survive. He was homeless, sleeping in the filthy avenues in the freezing cold amidst criminals and gangs and derelicts. He was close to suicide on a number of occasions, but eventually landed a job as a police reporter for the New York Tribune in the city's worst neighborhood, the 5 Points, with an office on Mulberry Street. He was more prepared than most to report on criminal behaviors and the lives of the poor souls occupying the dark pits of America's slums. But what he saw over time shook him so much that he said, "It gripped my heart until I felt I must tell of them or burst." But who were they that he found and he felt like he needed to do something about? So let's take a look. America, of course, had always been a nation of immigrants. It was always a country of diverse cultural and ethnic groups. But before the 1880s, it was not quite the diversity we know today. America was mostly made up of English and African Americans who were first stolen from Africa and brought here as slaves, but also the so-called old immigrants who had previously come from Northern and Western European stock. Germans and French and Scandinavians, and after 1848 and the potato famine, a tide of Irish. Aside from the Irish, most of these groups were Protestant, and many were at least somewhat literate and had some experience with political liberalism or some extent of democracy. But the so-called new immigrants who came after 1870 were a much different lot, primarily from Southern and Eastern Europe, but also from China and Japan as well. They were a mix of Catholic or Eastern Orthodox. Most were illiterate, and American democracy was as foreign to them as the English language. Italians was the largest group, but also Croatians and Serbs and Greeks, Russians, Poles, and Jews. There was what was called push factors that were driving many of these immigrants out of Asia and Europe. And they ranged from fleeing religious or political persecution, or if you're the Jews, both. Also fleeing unemployment and desperate poverty or forced conscription into the military. And then there were also pull factors, or things that were pulling them to America. And they range from America being seen as the land of opportunity, they're coming for jobs, they're coming for freedom, or for religious tolerance and safety from European wars. So you should see that the push and pull factors kind of complement one another. But of course, America was not the only destination at this time. Many fled to other areas in South or Central America as well. But it is true that America experienced more immigration than any other nation at the time. And it was also ironic that this was the time when the French had gifted America the Statue of Liberty, symbolizing America as a land of hope and freedom and promise to immigrants around the world. But there was also this sharp rise in anti-immigrant sentiment from many of those old stock immigrants. And again, ironically, this is often termed a rise of nativism. And though the Statue of Liberty was dedicated with Emma Lazarus's beautiful words that stated, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. Your wretched refuse of your teeming shores. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door." Gosh, that always does get me. But to many of the old stock Americans, a spirit of nativism arose that believed that the immigrants arriving were actually exactly like those being described in the poem. The lowest sorts, the wretched refuse or the garbage was coming to America and simply ruining the country. The nativists blamed immigrants for urban problems like crime or corruption, and that's in our next episode, so come back for that. Also blamed for lowering wages and stealing jobs and not Americanizing, or at least not Americanizing fast enough. Worst of these sentiments and attitudes were targeted at the Chinese, and the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed in 1893 that banned Chinese immigrants, the only group to be specifically prohibited with legislation.
So wait, did these immigrants really have no idea the hell they were going to be entering? Would they actually have come to America if they knew they were headed for the slums?
Well, Mahina, you're right. Many didn't know just what they were going to be getting into, and many of them came with high hopes and found miserable despair, at least at first. But it is true that America did offer opportunity and a better life for many. Letters from family members in America circulated back in the old country, filling them with hope of a new life and a new land. But no two immigrant stories were the same. Here's one Polish immigrant sending a letter home that said, "We eat here every day what we only get for Easter back in Poland." Or from Mariatin, another Polish immigrant, "So at last I was going to America. Really, really going at last. The boundaries burst, the arch of heaven soared, a million suns shined out of every star. The wind rushed in from outer space, roaring in my ears, America, America." And of course, it's going to be quite hard to live up to that image. But as long as we're on the quote train, I got one more that's my absolute favorite from an unknown Italian immigrant. "I came to America because I heard the streets were paved with gold. When I got here, I learned 3 things. First, the streets were not paved with gold. Second, they were not paved at all. Third, I was expected to pave them." Absolutely brilliant. And many of these poor immigrants lived in tenements or dumbbell tenements that were sometimes called human warehouses. They were rundown apartments in poor neighborhoods that were just packed with people. Most were 25 feet wide by 5 stories tall, where often 4 families might share one floor and with only one sink.
So, like, how would they all shower? I can't even stand sharing with my sister. Seriously, 4 other families? What the heck?
Actually, Kolohe, most tenements did not have showers or toilets at all, just a sink.
Good lord.
Yeah, and the hallways would often be stacked with garbage, which would choke out the very little light that could get through from the few windows on each floor. And this caused a major problem for Jacob Riis when he tried to raise awareness about the plight of these tenement dwellers, because you could not get a good photo in that darkness. So Riis had been hired by the New York Tribune as their police reporter and had to cover the most crime-ridden areas of New York City. Working in the worst areas of urban squalor, he quickly became horrified seeing just how so many Americans lived. Living in filthy and dangerous conditions that many of us today could just hardly imagine, he needed to do something about it. He first published articles for magazines hoping to stoke America's conscience and churn them into action, but his sketches and his words alone had little effect. Photographing the tenements and the dark alleys was nearly impossible due to the lack of light, but in 1887, technology for creating flash photography was invented by making a mix of manganese powder. Barely used in America at the time, a desperate Riis contacted 2 photographers with his idea about using flash technology to open Americans' eyes to the lives of those who were suffering out of sight and out of mind. Eventually printed in 1890 in his book, How the Other Half Lives, middle and upper class New Yorkers finally were exposed to the misery of so many living just miles from them in a city that they shared. They saw the crammed rooms stuffed with people and tiny apartments used as sweatshops so families could pull in additional income, dungy apartments, men squatting below garbage dumps and living amidst waste. Riis had, as you can imagine, a soft spot for the plight of children in the city. Some who slept on the streets, like these here huddling a grate for warmth, or just left alone to find trouble and danger in the back roads. Riis wrote, "Yet as I knew that dismal alley with its bare brick walls, between which no sun ever rose or set, was the world of those children. It filled their young lives. Probably not one of them had ever been out of the sight of it." Disease, unsurprisingly, ran rampant through these tenements, and it's no wonder that infant caskets was an industry in many cities at this time. His photos became documents into the depths of the darkest dens in Gotham. Armed with flash photography, Riis was bringing sunlight to shine onto the injustice that so often grows in the shadows. And How the Other Half Lives eventually sold 28 million copies, and 1 copy landed on the desk of a newly appointed civil service commissioner of New York City, a courageous reformer named Theodore Roosevelt, who sent a letter to Riis that said, "I've read your book and I've come to help." Both Riis and Roosevelt in the next decade would help to usher in the progressive movement that sought to address the horrible side effects of industrialization and urbanization. Within 2 decades of publishing, the worst of New York City's slums were torn down and building codes would be passed to improve safety and health conditions. And later, all New York City schools would be required to have playgrounds. And Kolohe, all apartments would eventually have toilets and showers. So I hope Riis' story reminds us today to bravely look at those who are the most vulnerable in our society and who many turn a blind eye to. And if it can make us grateful for small things like a shower or a toilet or our own bed, then ain't it lovely studying history? So thanks for engaging today. This has been History for Humans. And if you like what we're doing here, you can click and show it and subscribe because we've got a lot more history coming at you that's relevant and important. And stay tuned for the learning activity. All right, guys, we got a great doing history activity for you today. You're going to be doing a mini DBQ. That is a document-based question. So you'll be looking at a few primary sources, a diagram, a juicy excerpt from Riis's How the Other Half Lives, and one of his photographs. And for each one, you're going to answer a couple of comprehension questions, and these questions will help ensure that you're ready to answer the larger inquiry question in 2 to 3 paragraphs. Questions very similar to the exploration question in the story lecture, but with primary sources, you'll have your own ammunition to attack the question and develop your own creative response for it. So go into each document curious, and you're going to consider, what does this document reveal about the lives of the people in American cities? When forming a response to the inquiry question, be brave enough to think outside the box and have an original answer for this. But I know you're gonna rock it, and I'll catch you guys next time. Be good.